The SEAL commander stood on the ridge, his boots pressed into the loose gravel of a hillside that overlooked a ruined valley where smoke curled in thick black ribbons against the fading sky, the sound of gunfire rattling across the distance like a storm that would not end. His men crouched low behind shattered walls and burned-out vehicles, their eyes scanning the haze with the nervous intensity of men who had seen too many missions stretch beyond what was survivable, the commander knew. This ground was treacherous. The enemy had dug in with precision, setting machine guns in fortified nests and mortars in hidden spots, ready to hammer down on anything that dared move forward every time a helmet shifted above, cover a burst of fire. Chewed the concrete, and sparks flew across the field, reminding them that each inch of ground would be paid for in blood. The commander weighed the options in silence as radios crackled with clipped messages and scattered reports about enemy positions. His jaw set tight as he considered calling for air support, though he knew the sky was unreliable tonight, with storms rolling across the range and the threat of anti-aircraft batteries hidden in the hills. His men were tired, but not broken. Their discipline held like steel threads, but he could feel the weight pressing on them. The kind of pressure that told him one mistake, one order given in haste could unravel everything he had built with this team. It was then that a figure stepped from the shadows at the edge of the ridge, her movement deliberate but unhurried, the tall rifle slung against her shoulder with a casual balance that contrasted with the deadly environment surrounding them. She walked forward until the smoke lit her, outline against the sky, and the men turned to look at her with narrowed eyes. She wore no insignia, only a plain set of combat gear that revealed nothing about who she was or what command had sent her. The commander felt the doubt ripple through his unit as a few exchanged glances as if to ask silently why a stranger was walking into their lines at such a moment. The figure set down a pack with careful hands and unwrapped the rifle from its cover, the weapon gleaming under the dim light. Though it bore the marks of heavy use, she checked it with the precision of someone who had done this ritual thousands of times, running her fingers over the scope, the bolt, the trigger assembly. The silence grew heavier as the men watched, unsure. If they were looking at a savior or a liability, the commander crossed his arms, his voice low when he asked what her clearance was, but she gave no direct answer. Instead, her gaze swept the battlefield below as if she had already memorized every contour, every plume of smoke, every flicker of muzzle flash from the enemy lines. It unsettled the commander more than he expected because there was no hesitation in her manner, no pause for thought. She simply looked and absorbed with an efficiency. That made it clear she was not improvising. She was recalling something already known. The men shifted uncomfortably, some with smirks of disbelief, others with quiet unease because no one just walked into this kind of chaos without fear, without nerves, without even blinking at the thunder of bullets tearing through the distance. The commander thought about pulling her back, ordering her to stand down until he could verify her orders, but something in her presence froze the words in his throat. She knelt at the edge of the ridge, her movements fluid and unbroken, as if guided by muscle memory older than her age. Her rifle laid across her knee with reverence that looked like both ritual and instinct, and the air around them changed as though the battlefield itself leaned closer to see what she would do next. His men whispered among themselves, one muttering that she would be dead in seconds if she tried to take a shot, another insisting she was just a distraction from command. Someone sent to observe rather than fight, but all of them fell silent when she adjusted her scope and drew in a breath so steady it did not belong in a war zone. Her hair shifted slightly in the wind, her eyes locked on the distant tower where the enemy command operated, and her body stilled like a statue. The commander felt something he had not felt in years, a hesitation born not of fear, but of anticipation. He realized that every decision he had prepared, every calculation about casualties and angles of attack might shift entirely depending on what she chose to do in the next moment. He saw the barrel of the rifle align perfectly with the far-off structure through smoke and dust and distance too great for most sharpshooters to even attempt. He told himself it was impossible that no one could see that far with clarity, let alone fire with any expectation of a hit yet. She remained steady, her finger brushing against the trigger without pressure. Her breathing so slow he could count the rhythm between each rise and fall. The commander turned to his men and saw the disbelief mirrored in their eyes, but none of them dared speak. Not now. Not when something hung in the air so tense it felt like the world itself was holding breath. And then with a motion almost invisible, she settled her cheek against the stock of the rifle, the scope glinting faintly as if signaling some unseen force across the battlefield. The commander opened his mouth to demand an explanation to remind her that this was not her operation and not her fight, but the words never left his lips, because in that suspended moment, he knew that what came next would change the battle in ways he could not predict. No one in the unit expected much from her, since she had appeared without fanfare, stepping into the chaos as though she belonged, yet never stating who had cleared her arrival. The soldiers knew her file existed, but most of it was obscured with redacted lines, black bars concealing her past, leaving only fragments that meant little to men who measured worth by scars and battle stories. She offered none of those. Instead, she carried a quietness that unsettled the toughest among them, because silence in war could be more frightening than shouting. Her posture was not stiff like recruits or restless like mercenaries. It was composed and patient, like a predator waiting in tall grass. The seals who had fought in jungles, deserts, and cities whispered to each other about what sort of operative she might be, but none could guess with certainty. Her eyes, however, drew their attention again and again, not because they were striking, but because they moved differently, never distracted by the gunfire, never wavering when explosions rattled the ridge. Her gaze cut across the battlefield like a blade, dissecting angles, calculating lines of sight, tracking shadows and movements invisible to ordinary soldiers. The commander noticed first how she ignored the obvious targets. The machine, gun nests spitting constant fire, or the mortar crews preparing another round. Instead, her focus lingered on the faintest signs, like a glint from glass high in a tower, or the subtle rhythm of figures moving where no one else had looked. The commander followed her line of sight and realized she had found something he had missed, something critical that made him tighten his grip on the radio in frustration that his intel had been incomplete. The men muttered among themselves, one suggesting she had to be CIA, another insisting she was probably from some experimental program designed to push human limits, a third shaking his head, saying it did not matter, because no outsider ever came into their unit without reason. Still, they could not hide their unease, because her presence felt less like reinforcement and more like judgment, as if she was not here to fight beside them, but to weigh their worth against a standard none of them could meet. One soldier nudged another, whispering that she would fold the second. Real fire pinned them down, but his voice cracked as he said it, because deep down he did not believe his own words. He had seen her hands when she checked the rifle, calm, precise, steady, even as artillery shook the ground. Most men betrayed nerves in their fingers, a tremor, a twitch. Anything to betray the storm inside her hands betrayed nothing. They moved with the grace of water flowing over stone, and the men watching could not reconcile that grace with the violence about to unfold. The commander stepped closer, testing her with a question sharp enough to demand obedience, but she only tilted her head in acknowledgement without lowering her scope. The lack of reaction stung more than open defiance, because it meant she did not feel bound to him or his command. He wanted to snap, remind her that this was his field, his men, his operation. But again, something restrained him, a sense that her role extended beyond his authority, a reminder that wars were fought not only with weapons, but with secrets layered in shadows above his rank. Her gaze narrowed as she adjusted the scope, the muscles of her jaw tightening with each turn. The commander watched her exhale, then hold the breath in a stillness that seemed unnatural. As if time itself bent around her, men shifted waiting for the crack of a shot, but none came. Instead, she let out the breath and pulled back slightly as though confirming something unseen. Her lips moved faintly, but no sound reached them, and for a moment the commander thought she was praying. Yet her eyes held no trace of devotion, only relentless calculation. The silence broke when mortars struck near their flank, the ground shuddering with force that threw dust into the air. Men shouted for position, but her head never turned, her focus anchored on that distant tower where the enemy generals moved behind shrouded glass. Her body language radiated certainty, as if she already knew the pattern of their movement, the timing of their steps, the exact second when one would stand in just the right place. Her confidence unnerved the men. Because confidence without evidence was recklessness, and yet this did not feel reckless, it felt inevitable. One soldier cursed under his breath, calling it madness that she thought she could see through smoke and distance with nothing but a scope. But another shook his head, muttering that maybe madness was the only thing that worked against an enemy like this. The commander kept silent, listening to their fear swirl like ash on the wind, and he realized she had already taken command without speaking a word, because all eyes watched her more than they watched him. Her rifle shifted slightly, aligning more precisely with the tower, and the commander felt the air grow tighter every second. Stretched into an eternity, men holding their breath. As though exhaling might break her focus, the enemy continued its barrage, unaware that the balance of the fight trembled on the edge of one trigger pull. The commander knew that if she failed, it would shatter morale. If she succeeded, it would change everything. And yet he could not decide which possibility frightened him more. Still, she did not fire. She waited patient and unblinking while chaos surrounded her, and the men began to realize that waiting itself was a weapon. Every second she held steady forced them to question their doubts, forced them to imagine what she might be capable of, forced them to confront the possibility that the impossible was about to unfold. The commander glanced at his watch, though time meant nothing here, because her rhythm was not tied to seconds. It was tied to certainty. At last, she leaned closer to the rifle. Her body coiled not with tension but with lethal readiness. The commander felt the words rising in his throat to order her back to demand. She justify her presence, but his voice failed as his instincts told him the shot was already inevitable and no command could stop it. He clenched his fists against the weight of helplessness for the first time in years and turned his eyes toward the tower where unseen enemies directed the destruction below, unaware that a single unseen predator had fixed them in her sights. The men crouched lower. The commander gritted his teeth. The battlefield roared louder, yet inside that storm there was a silence that belonged only to her. And in that silence, every man knew something was coming, something they could not stop. And the only question that remained was what would be left standing when it finally arrived. The commander pointed to the enemy stronghold, his hand cutting through the dust-filled air as he explained that 3 high-value generals were directing the counterattack from a tower reinforced with steel and concrete, buried deep inside the fortified zone. He spoke with the authority of a man who had seen countless battles, but there was a hint of frustration in his tone, because he knew what he was describing was not simply a position. It was a fortress impossible to breach without sacrifice. He told her that every path to the tower had been mapped, and each path ended with death. His scouts had confirmed overlapping fields of fire-kill zones, waiting for anyone foolish enough to advance. And he stressed that a frontal assault would mean dozens of his men cut down before they even reached the halfway point. He had rehearsed his options again and again in his mind, calling for artillery, risking an airstrike, or launching a night raid, but each carried its own ruinous cost. Yet as he laid out the hopelessness, he noticed she was not reacting at all. No flinch at the mention of heavy weapons, no shake of the head when he described the density of enemy fire. She simply listened, her eyes locked not on him, but on the distant tower beyond the smoke and flames, as though her mind was already walking through the walls, seeing lines of weakness invisible to him. The commander found himself speaking faster, trying to impress the impossibility upon her, perhaps hoping to drag her back into the realm of reason. But the more he spoke, the more he realized she was not weighing his words. She was filtering them, discarding what was irrelevant, holding on to only what mattered. Her silence unnerved him more than open defiance, because silence meant she was beyond persuasion. She was already operating by a code that did not bend to his authority. When he finished, he expected at least a question or some hesitation, but instead, she slowly knelt, lowering herself into position with her rifle settling. Across her lap, as naturally as breath, the men around them shifted, exchanging uneasy glances, as though they had just watched her accept a challenge that none of them believed could be met. She adjusted the scope with precise motions, as if the tower were only a few steps away, rather than an impossible distance through smoke, chaos, and death. The commander leaned closer, his voice sharp, as he reminded her that this was not training. This was war, and those men inside the tower were not static targets. They were surrounded by guards, reinforced by armor, protected by layers of steel, but she gave no sign she had heard him. Her focus tunneled through the scope. Her breathing slowed until even the noise of the battlefield seemed to fade around her. He thought of pulling her back, ordering her to stand down, but even as the thought formed, he knew it would not matter, because something about her presence radiated inevitability, as if she had been placed here, not by orders, but by fate. The men around her began to feel it too, their mutters fading, their smirks dissolving, until all that remained was a heavy silence broken only by the distant roar of gunfire. She adjusted her position, settling against the rubble that lined the ridge. Her movements, smooth and deliberate, the rifle an extension of her body, not an instrument but a limb, and when she closed one eye and brought the scope fully to bear on the tower, the commander felt a chill climb his spine, because he realized she was not testing angles. She was not experimenting. She was confirming she had already solved the puzzle before anyone had spoken a word. Through the smoke, the tower loomed, its windows reflecting flickers of fire, its walls scarred by earlier shelling, but still standing. Defiant, the figures within moved like shadows behind the glass, faint outlines of men directing entire battalions with radios and signals, their confidence resting on the strength of their fortress, unaware that one gaze had fixed them in place. The commander followed her line and saw them faintly through binoculars, but the distance was too great, too unstable. He could not even keep the image steady yet. Her rifle never wavered. She steadied her breathing. One inhale, one exhale, then stillness, her finger brushing the trigger with the softness of a whisper. The men behind her leaned forward without realizing they had moved their own hearts, pounding in rhythm with her silence, as if her focus had spread across them, binding them into her. Calm, and then the shot cracked a sound so sharp it cut through the chaos of battle like a blade. The commander jerked his binoculars instinctively, expecting nothing but smoke and confusion, yet he saw it clear as day. One of the figures inside the tower staggered, then fell out of view. The radio clutched in his hand, dropping lifelessly. The tower windows flickered with sudden panic as soldiers within scrambled. The silence among the SEALs turned into stunned disbelief, one man whispering that it was luck, another shaking his head saying no. Luck could bend a bullet through smoke and steel and distance like that. Before the words even finished, another shot rang out faster than thought. The second figure collapsed in the same space, the glass, shattering around him like ice under pressure. Men shouted in the tower, but their voices were drowned by the third shot. A strike so swift, the commander almost doubted his own eyes, because in less than a breath, 3 generals' men who had been untouchable behind fortifications had fallen, their power silenced by a single rifle in the hands of the woman beside him. The battlefield itself seemed to pause for an instant, the enemy fire faltering as though the chain of command had snapped. The SEALs blinked. In shock, some staring at her, others at the tower. One soldier dropped to his knees with a laugh that sounded half madness, half awe. The commander, though, felt none of that. He felt a weight pressing into his chest, a realization that went beyond the impossible shot she had fired, because he knew no human could calculate those angles with such speed. No one could see through shifting smoke and make corrections in less than a heartbeat. No one could remain so calm, so detached as if the chaos around her did not exist. She had done something that should not have been done, and as the smoke drifted from her barrel, she did not smile. She did not show pride or even relief. She only lowered the rifle slightly, her face unchanged, her eyes fixed on the horizon as though the tower had never mattered at all. The men waited for her to speak, but she said nothing, leaving them to wrestle with what they had seen, their whispers rising like a storm. Each soldier trying to make sense of it. One calling her a ghost, another swearing she was not human. The commander silenced them with a look, but his own thoughts were louder than theirs. He wondered what command had sent into his unit who had trained her, what purpose she served, because no operative, no matter how skilled, could bend war itself to their will with 3 bullets in less than 3 seconds. And as he watched her stand from the rubble, her movement slow and deliberate, the rifle still in her grasp, he realized the tower was only the beginning, that whatever she had come here to do was far from finished, and the dread in his chest told him the battlefield had just shifted into a war he no longer understood. Her breathing slowed as the chaos of gunfire echoed across the valley, and the team waited in tense silence, their ears ringing from the sudden crack of the rifle, yet their eyes locked on her unmoving figure. When the first general fell, they thought it was chance. When the second dropped, they thought it was impossible. And when the third collapsed before the commander could even speak, they realized they were no longer witnessing battle. They were witnessing something outside their understanding. The air around them changed, the rhythm of the firefight stuttered as though the enemy itself had lost breath. Their mortars fell silent for a span. The bursts of machine gun fire slowed, confused voices drifting from radios as the chain of command snapped in an instant. The enemy forces scrambled like ants struck by a sudden storm. They did not know where to move, what orders to follow, and for the first time since the mission began, the battlefield leaned toward silence. The SEALs stared at her, none daring to speak, as smoke coiled from the rifle barrel. The commander's thoughts racing faster than he could control. He had seen master snipers before, legends in his field who could strike at 1,000 yards and beyond, but never at this speed, never with this precision, and never under such conditions. Dust, wind, smoke, chaos. Every factor screamed against the possibility. Yet she had bent those factors into obedience, as if the world itself had yielded to her will. The commander wanted to demand answers, but words tangled in his throat, because deep down he was afraid of what those answers might be if she revealed training beyond their knowledge, if she named a program buried so deep even he had never heard of it, if she spoke of conditioning or augmentation or something worse. He was not sure he could carry that truth without breaking trust with his men. Her posture did not shift. She did not bask in awe or even glance at the men who stared. She simply adjusted her rifle once more, as if the shots she had delivered were only warm-up exercises, her gaze sliding across the battlefield, seeking the next pattern, seeking the next fracture in the enemy defense. She treated the death of 3 generals as nothing more than a step along a path the rest of them could not see. One soldier whispered that they should move. Now press the attack while the enemy reeled. Another shook his head, saying it was madness without confirmation of the remaining defenses, but both fell silent when her hand lifted slightly, a gesture not commanding yet enough to halt them. Her focus remained fixed outward, not back toward them, and the unspoken message was clear. The time was not yet right. The commander studied, her face looking for strain or nerves, but he found none. No sweat, Despite the heat, no tremor. Despite the noise, her eyes calm yet sharp, her breathing steady. He had seen soldiers numb from trauma, but this was different. This was not numbness. It was calculation layered over something colder. Her silence was not emptiness, it was discipline unbroken, even by the enormity of what she had just done. A radio crackled at his side, reports of enemy positions shifting, of soldiers scattering without direction, of fire teams retreating into the hills. It was a moment of advantage, the kind commanders waited for years to exploit, yet he felt hesitation for the first time. His instinct telling him that rushing forward might still trigger disaster, because the woman beside him had not moved to advance. She remained poised, rifle still sweeping horizon lines as if warning them that what they saw was only the surface. She shifted suddenly, not firing but lowering her scope slightly, her body angling toward a section of ruined buildings to the left. Her lips parted, but no words came still. The commander understood. He lifted his binoculars, scanning the same zone, and saw movement, subtle, too coordinated to be panic. The enemy was regrouping quickly, faster than expected, men taking positions along rooftops. Weapons being readied, it was clear the generals had not been their only leaders. Someone else was stepping into command, unseen but dangerous. The commander cursed under his breath, realizing the trap had not yet been broken. His men tensed, weapons raised as the battlefield roared back to life, the silence shattered by renewed bursts of fire. The enemy had recovered enough to resist, and the advantage of shock was slipping away. He turned to the woman to see if she had marked the same thing, but her gaze was already locked on the new threat, her rifle rising again in smooth, unhurried lines. He reached for her shoulder, ready to demand she explain her purpose, her orders, her allegiance. But he stopped when her finger tightened slightly against the trigger. The same stillness overtook her as before, and the men around her held their breath again, unwilling yet unable to look away. The commander felt his pulse race, knowing another impossible moment was about to unfold. A shot cracked sharp and clean, cutting through the noise of battle once more, and from the distant rooftops a figure tumbled backward, his rifle clattering into the dust. The enemy formation staggered, confusion rippling. Through their ranks another shot followed, then another, each one finding a precise mark, hidden figures falling before they had time to signal, before they had time to fire. She dismantled the recovery before it could even begin. The men around her no longer whispered disbelief. Now they stared with something closer to fear, because awe alone could not explain what they saw. She was not simply skilled, she was beyond skill. Her senses cutting through smoke, her hands steady against chaos, her timing perfect, as if the world moved in rhythm with her breath. The commander clenched his jaw, torn between gratitude and suspicion, because every bullet that struck true saved his men, but every bullet also deepened the mystery of who she was and why she had been sent here. If she could end wars with a rifle, why had no one known of her? Why had she been hidden until now? His chest tightened with the realization that perhaps she had not been hidden at all. Perhaps she had been unleashed for the first time. The battlefield shifted again, the enemy lines faltering, their structure collapsing, yet the commander could not shake the feeling that this was not victory. Not yet. It was only the unveiling of something greater, and as he turned to look at her, he saw the faintest trace of something in her expression, not satisfaction, not relief, but focus on something farther away, something none of them could see. Yet her rifle lowered slightly, she stood slowly, her silhouette rising against the smoke-filled horizon, and the commander felt his breath catch because he realized she was not finished, not even close, and whatever lay ahead would push them beyond the limits of war itself. The men were frozen, unsure if what they had seen was even real, as smoke drifted from her rifle barrel and the battlefield shifted in seconds. Yet the commander's mind was racing because he knew no sniper alive could have calculated those shots in that time, and the look on her face revealed nothing. He studied her stance, searching for weakness, searching for the human flaw that should have been there after such impossible action, but he found none. Her breath was even her shoulders squared. Her eyes sharp and unblinking, she was still ready, still, cold, and still calculating, as if the 3 kills were only an opening move in a much larger game. Around them, the men began to whisper again, their voices carrying a mix of awe and dread, some calling her a savior, others calling her something unnatural. One soldier muttered that she was a weapon, not a person, and another snapped at him to stay quiet because no one knew if she was listening and what she might do if she took offense to their fear. The commander forced his focus back to the field, where the enemy was still reeling without their generals. Their lines had faltered but not broken, yet soldiers still moved in the haze, scrambling to rally under someone else, and the commander knew the next minutes would decide the outcome of the mission. If they moved, now they could strike deep and end this, or if they hesitated, the enemy might rise again with fury. He turned to her to give the order, but stopped, as he saw her lowering the rifle and looking toward the horizon, her expression unreadable as though her mind was already steps ahead of them. Her silence pressed against him harder than the roar of any gun, because it carried the weight of knowledge he did not have. She knew something. She had seen something none of them had. And the commander realized with a slow chill that their survival now hinged not on his command, but on whatever she chose to reveal or to keep hidden. She stood with the same quiet calm and handed the rifle back to the stunned unit before turning her gaze toward the horizon as if the mission was only half finished. The commander stared, unable to find words, his men shifting uneasily behind him, none daring to move. First, the air felt heavy, charged with the weight of what had just unfolded. The enemy fire was fading, the chain of command broken. Yet the silence was not victory. It was the silence of something unfinished. The men sensed it too, their hands tightening on rifles, their eyes darting from her to the smoke-filled horizon, as though expecting another wave to emerge. At any moment she gave no orders, no explanation. Yet her presence alone seemed to dictate that nothing was over. Yet, the commander stepped closer, ready to demand her identity, but when her eyes met his, he froze. There was nothing hostile in her look, but there was no warmth either. Only the steady intensity of someone who had already accepted the cost of whatever. Came next, he realized then that he might never learn her origin, never know if she was trained or born for this, if she was soldier or something else entirely. A low rumble shook the ground, distant at first, then closer. The men tensed weapons, raising, as shapes began to move in the haze, larger than infantry, slower but relentless armored vehicles crawling back into formation.